Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of Catalyst Story Road Seminar Series. My name is Philip Gilpin Jr., and I am the CEO and Executive Director of Catalyst. I'm here today just to make some introductions, and then I'll be working behind the scenes to take your questions online. So if you're watching on Facebook and YouTube with us, put your questions in the comments section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can later on in the hour. Thanks for watching, and at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our host for the hour, Miss Marilyn Suchan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn Suchan, a producer of Catalyst and your host today. I want to introduce our two speakers today. We have Dan Levy and Neel Shah.
Hey.
Dan Levy, hey. I'll just read a little bio about each of you. Dan Levy is a comedian, writer, producer based in Los Angeles. He is currently the creator and executive producer of the NBC comedy Indebted, starring Fran Drescher. Dan previously wrote on shows like the Goldbergs and Whitney, and since getting his start as a comedian in college, he has performed on numerous late-night shows and Comedy Central, and in 2016, he released a special for NBC's comedy network, Seeso. Then we have Neel Shah, who is a producer, writer, known for The Bold Type, Powerless, and Men at Work. He also created a new show coming out on Netflix in October called Messy. And Messy is a 6-episode comedy that was shot in India. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining me today.
We sound really good. I'm feeling
epic.
That sounds great. Sounds cool. Yeah.
So let's jump right on in. And why don't you guys tell us what's the most important thing for people to know about a writer's room, about what you do working with the people in your room?
Well, Neel and I actually met. We knew each other, but we became really good friends working on Whitney season 1, and that was a writer's room with super talented people. Everyone had so much experience, and Neel and I were like the younger writers there. And I feel like what I learned in that room quickly was that, getting along with everyone and, being friendly and listening was so much more important than necessarily like constantly pitching or being annoying. And I know it sounds funny, but that's like a huge thing in writer's room that I think some people don't realize when you go in, especially my background, which was stand-up. Like I never worked in an office ever. So I never had like a 9-to-5 or anything like that. So you start to realize that office politics are a real thing, even in a writer's room, because you're just sitting next to people all day long. So yeah, you can be a really talented writer, but if you're annoying, then it doesn't matter because people will stop listening to you because they can't deal with whatever your thing is.
Yeah, I feel like there's even the word writer's room is sort of a misnomer because there's actually not that much literal writing you do with the job. It's 90% of the job is just talking and interacting with people and sort of telling stories. So Dan's totally right that it's a much more social job than you might expect. And I think if people are used to just writing by themselves or doing their own thing, that transition can be a little bit jarring. So it's good to keep in mind that it is not really a job for people who aren't social or like working with people. You can write movies if that's the case for you.
Yeah, and one of the writers I remember told us a story when we worked together. There was a young writer on his staff, and every time there would be breaks, he'd open his laptop in the writer's room and start working on a movie, and people hated him. Because that's just like not the kind of behavior that you want to see in a writer's room. It's like you want to just pitch on stories or have personal stories that can relate to the show or just a funny thing, that just happens. I remember my friend Dan Mintz, who's a great writer, and he's been on several staffs, and he one time told me that if you could just say something funny like every 2 hours, whether it's about the show or in general, like you're in good shape for the day.
Quality versus quantity.
Because if you leave the day and you're like, man, Neel was so funny today, like it doesn't matter if Neel was funny about like an episode idea or because he had this amazing story from college. Like you just remember like Neel has great ideas,
Right.
That's all that matters.
And you never really know what's going to turn into something that you use for the show. So yeah, it's important to find the right balance between making sure you're listening when you're young and also piping up and participating and not feeling like you're just getting totally overshadowed.
Right.
Exactly.
But then how do you inspire those who maybe aren't as self-aware to not take over the conversation so the rest of the writer's room can have that equal participation?
Yeah, I've been in rooms where if there is someone who feels like they're dominating the conversation or taking up too much of the bandwidth, people will pull that person aside and actually say, hey, just so you know, you should give other people a chance to talk before the boss gets annoying. Yeah. So it is acceptable to have moments like that, and hopefully you'll be in a room where people will actually take some initiative and deal with you in a human way rather than just making fun of you behind your back.
Yeah, right. I feel like a good showrunner. I remember our showrunner Betsy when we worked together. When we had her we did a full season, like 22 episodes, something like that, 24 episodes. So we had like a Christmas break sort of like sit down, and she was sort of giving you notes on like your performance so far. And she was like, wow. She was like, the one thing I tell you is like, you don't need to pitch so much, you don't need to constantly like say things because you're like a lower level writer. I knew Whitney well, so I felt comfortable, and everyone was so nice that I did feel comfortable. And you realize like you don't like my job as like a staff writer, story editor is not to like come up with solutions. It's like to help and like pitch on ideas, and I don't need to do that constantly,
Right.
And I feel like you'll also like, when you're in charge, you just have to talk to people. You have to say, hey, like a big thing now writing in this day and age is like, your phones. It's such a huge distraction, So some writers' rooms, they just kind of get lax and people are on their phones a lot. And then it's hard because you're not really paying attention. So you most rooms are like, no, you try to like at least no phones unless it's an emergency. Ideally you can just kind of like focus better. So that's the thing I feel like has to happen more and more, where people are like, hey, just stop looking at your phone.
Right.
But it's hard because phones are awesome.
Right. There's so much to check on. You have your Facebook, your Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys have a lot of fans.
Oh,
so you got to keep track of them all. But I love how you mentioned that you got started in stand-up comedy. Can you both talk about what you started out doing with your careers and how that led you into entertainment and the writer's room specifically?
So, you want to go first, Dan?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was doing, in the sitcom world and like specifically like even like especially like multicams, like stand-up comedians like, throughout time have always sort of like, transitioned into that, because a lot of times like there's Mike Royce, who runs One Day at a Time and was one of the EPs of Raymond. He was really good friends with Ray Romano, so they'll call their friends and say, hey, work on my sitcom, you're so great with jokes. And that's kind of a good way in. And that happened with me with Whitney, and I knew her from stand-up, so I just basically came in really unsure like what that job was, because like in my world, stand-up and writing was like two very different things. Like I didn't know a lot of like sitcom writers. I thought like those were mostly like the Lampoon guys, and then when you get there, you realize it's like, oh no, there's a whole different world of like hilarious, talented people.
Yeah.
So it was fun. That was kind of my way in.
Yeah, I think that's actually maybe if you want to just even take a step back and talk about the paths people take towards getting into writers' rooms, there's I guess two different paths.
Yeah. Or
two main paths. One path is there's people who start off as assistants, and those are writers' assistants. Yeah.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. Those are people who are, working for a showrunner or working for a producer, who are then getting a job as the writer's assistant who's taking notes in a room, and then hopefully will use that as a stepping stone to getting promoted. And there's a lot of people who do that, and that's like the most sort of traditional path, and one that maybe has like an actual way, like an actual path forward that you can see and you can sort of apply yourself to doing. And then there's the other path, which is the one that Dan kind of alluded to, which is like people who had other jobs, be it stand-up or be it someone who had written a really funny movie script, or in my case, I was a journalist in New York. And so you have some sort of background that feels germane to the show that you're applying for, so that when you get hired, you have a body of work that maybe spoke for itself, and then you also have a script that then someone will read and say, oh, this person would be a value add. So if there are people wondering about the paths, it's usually either writer's assistant which is like more of like the traditional way in, and then there's the other way, which is I already have an agent based on something that I wrote, and I'm going to try to use my script to get a job that way.
Yeah, and I've now like worked with like a bunch of different writers with all different paths, and like sometimes and everyone is good, you know. And I feel like I worked with a writer on the Goldbergs for a long time who started that way, you know, started assistant and writer assistant and moved his way up to now he's like supervisor producer, and he knew the show so well, you know, because when you're a writer assistant on a show that like hits and it just goes, I feel like you really know the DNA inside out, and people, even though you know even though you might just be like a producer level at a certain point, you've been there for so long that you have sort of like the mindset of like an EP, you know, so that's really helpful. But yeah, but hiring people, I will say, like, I look for different people this year who have interesting paths, you know, so like I hired someone from, you know, who was like a journalist. There was someone from the Groundlings, you know, I hired a writer assistant who was just in Second City because I was like, you know what, I just want as many funny people as possible in a room, you know, and so it's fun to like fill a team that way, you know, with all different ideas. But then you also at the top, you got to have people who have like made these shows before over and over again, because at the end of the day, like, you know, your EPs and your co-EPs are really like putting the show together with the help of everyone else. But you really need to lean on those people, mostly because they take all the money anyways. So you have to.
Yeah. So for those at home who may not know, can you break down the different levels of writers in the room and what each of those mean, what their responsibilities are for the room?
Yeah, there's the entry level job that, you know, most people take when they're starting off as a staff writer. And that is a job where you're, like Dan was saying, you're not expected to like pull heavy weight in terms of like breaking story or fixing problems, but you're just supposed to be funny and participate on a comedy and, you know, try to pitch when you can on a drama side. And then it's, you know, there's 5 or 6 different levels from writer, staff writer. The next level up is called executive story editor. From executive story editor, the next writer up is called co-producer, and then it goes to producer, supervising producer, co-EP, and then EP. And the thing with the room is, you know, they're not necessarily that hierarchical because you're in a room, everyone's sitting at the same table, everyone can talk. There's no sort of like formalized roles for who can talk when. So everyone is kind of on a level playing field. And I've been in rooms where some of the younger writers are the ones who are doing more work than the older ones. And I've been in rooms where the inverse, but it's really just a function of experience.
Yeah. And so what is that relationship like, getting into each of the pitches and breaking things down among those different level writers? Are certain levels talking more than others and contributing more?
Yeah, I think generally, like Dan was saying, people who are at the more senior levels are the ones who kind of are responsible for pitching maybe bigger story arcs or you know, if there's a problem the day before production and you have a rewrite to do, those tasks will generally be delegated to more senior people, and the other younger levels are just sort of there for, you know, I think a good thing for staff writers to remember is that like pitching jokes is really important on a comedy. Like you want to just make sure that that's the way you can participate if you because you don't necessarily have the experience to be helping on it in a different way. So, but yeah, you know, again, it's not super regimented because people are a lot, like it's kind of a free for all once you're all at the same table.
Right.
Yeah. And I was going to add that even though, you know, if you're a staff writer or a story editor and, you know, and you know, you maybe come from especially like I worked with someone who worked at GQ for years, you know, and then came and was a staff writer on a show. And obviously as a writer, she was so talented. So like right away she got it, you know. So I feel like sometimes even though you are a staff writer and you know there's not a lot of pressure on you, if you could rise to the occasion and you could step up, it's amazing. And then everyone talks about you. And then it's like, you know, if that show goes away and it's staffing season again, people start saying, oh, you got to hire this person. They're like ridiculous and they're a story editor, you know? So there is a lot of that too. So it's not like, you know, I feel like it's a great starting out job because you don't have that pressure. But if you could figure it out quickly, which a lot of people can sometimes, then it really is helpful. But it's still just like figuring out the politics and all that stuff is like just as hard as figuring out how to write the show. you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for you two, when it comes to staffing your room, do you have the final say in who is staffed in your room, or how does that work with your network or studio exec?
Dan, you dealt with this with the network recently.
Yeah, I mean, I was with Sony and NBC. So the way it kind of works is you have writers who are under, your overall deals at the studios. So they try to fill those up first. So they'll send you a list of a bunch of, people who could work if they have people available. And then the network has sort of their idea of who should be like your number 2 person, which is sometimes, that's just the way it goes. Like you might have like a buddy you want hired on your show, but NBC might not think of them as like a number 2, and then you just can't hire them, especially on a first year show. I think as a show goes and you have more say, you could start to do what you want, but definitely like first year, second year shows, I have to sort of listen to them and that's kind of, and they sort of like will direct you with who they like. And then you have your lists. And then, for the most part, I get to pull the trigger, but they have to like approve everyone. So even if you want someone, then it has to be approved. And then you get in a situation sometimes where people have multiple offers, then you're kind of fighting over people. And what happened with me, which was, kind of was my first experience really doing it, is that it's really, and this year's different because there's not really upfronts and things are so chaotic. But, when you're fighting over people and, you get so caught up in like the upper level, and then you quickly find out like, oh, you're actually out of money. So now who else then you have to like kind of hire a bunch of other people, but you run out of money so quickly, which you never think about. And I always thought as a writer, you're always like, man, they could pay me more money, but like the studio has the money. Like they're in charge of it. So it doesn't, you could be like, I want my friend to get X amount of money because they deserve it. Like they don't care. They have, like, they know what they could pay people, and that's kind of what it is. So that was an interesting thing that I learned quickly is like, they have to approve everyone and they have to approve the money, and then you have to hope that you don't lose people, and at the same time, you're also trying to vet people too. So that's what we go back to our first conversation, which is then you're calling people and saying like, hey, is this person annoying? That's the first question.
Yeah.
And then, or you send an email, and then if someone writes back and says, I'll call you, then you know that it's probably
they're annoying. Yeah.
They're annoying. So that was my process. I don't know what it was like for Netflix because it was a different situation.
Yeah, our room was a smaller order. It was only 6 episodes, so they were pretty lenient with the writers that we wanted to hire. They didn't have a ton of input. We also it wasn't as big of a budget show, so we didn't have as big of a staff. But yeah, I think generally speaking, the producing pods have the people they want, and the studio will have people they want, and then the creators will have people they want, and staffing just becomes a puzzle of trying to piece together whose needs get serviced. It's kind of how it goes.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit more about the differences and the nuances between working for a studio versus working for a network?
Yeah. So the networks, will be the things like ABC or Fox or CBS or Netflix or Amazon. Those are the networks, and then they're who are distributing the content, and then there are people who are actually producing the content. And all of those places have their own studios. Like there's the CBS studios and Universal Studios and ABC Studios, and then there are also other producing partners, that are independent production companies that are the people who are putting together these shows, who then, like the producers are the ones who are then bringing those shows to the network. So in terms of when you have a final show on the air, there's multiple pods of people who are all responsible for a show coming together at the end.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if you were going to elaborate more on that, or if just the affirmative.
I said it so perfectly.
You said it so perfectly, but yeah, the studio's paying for it, and but the network puts it on TV. So the first year shows, everyone's really invested. So you get basically it just means you get 2 sets of notes. A long time ago, the studio was just the bank. So like they would just make a TV show and you get notes from your network, and that would be it. And the studios would just kind of finance everything. But now we're in a situation where they're both doing it, so you have lots of people involved. But
yeah,
I felt, I feel like I was, you hear a lot of like crazy stories and you see that movie like a TV set, but my experience, both the studio and the network were really helpful. In a first season multicam, it could go the complete other way.
right.
Where, when we worked on Whitney, they were like, sometimes they'd change the idea of what the show should be week to week. They'd be like, now it's a workplace show. We're like, what? And then you'd show up the next day and they'd like build like a essential perk for the show. Like everything was just sort of like constantly like fluid. But my experience was good with both of them.
Great. Yeah. So in this relationship, what does the development process look like for both of you with the shows that you've had in terms of getting that ball rolling?
Right. Development can go a few different ways. Sometimes you have an idea that's your own, and then your agent will set a bunch of meetings for you with what they're called pods. So different producing entities, and you just sort of go around town doing what's like sort of like the general loop, which is where you go talk to someone and they give you a tiny water bottle, and then you go on to your next meeting and you get another tiny water bottle, and by the end of the day you have to pee. That's just kind of how that goes. But usually, hopefully, you take one of those meetings and you vibe with the person who's you've been meeting with, and then you guys what it's called develop the show together, where you come up with a pitch, which can be anywhere from just like a story idea and character ideas and episode ideas, but you sort of build out the show that you want to eventually have on TV. And once you have a pitch, you will take meetings with the networks and go around and try to sell that idea to a network. So that's like the traditional path is like you have an idea and then you meet with a producing pod or a studio and they like it, and then you shape it together, and then you go off and you sell that to a network. It is sometimes possible to also write a script on your own, and then later in the game just sell that directly to a network, but that happens a little bit. Those are rarer instances.
It's become harder to sell specs.
Right.
Especially, before the quarantine stuff. Now I think with the quarantine, if you go out with the spec and like a big piece of talent, I think you're in a good place. Like they just had that, like I think they just announced that they're doing the big Will Ferrell TV show, and like that was a spec that went out, So it obviously with huge talent, a lot of things are possible.
Yeah, a pitch can just be your show, or it can be a show with a director you like, or you can actually go and get talent. There's a lot of different ways to do it.
And there's a lot of ways to that you could get sent down wrong roads. Neel and I developed a show for HBO a couple years ago with a production company, and they were sort of like, it was for HBO. So we were basically trying to like, beef up the project, like make it look like sexier than it was because it's HBO. So you're trying to get it made. So we would like write a show, and then they're like, we should actually hook you guys up with like a big time director. So we went and pitched the show, which we already sold, to a giant director. And they were like, okay, he really likes it. Change this, change that. So we got together and we changed the entire show for this director. And then like a few weeks later, not even, it was the longest process ever. Like a few months later, the director was like, I don't think so. And we're like, wait, but we changed the show and it's sold. So like that happens too.
Yeah.
Oh man.
But my experience the past couple of years, I've been developing mostly for like network. So it's and before the quarantine, obviously it was the cycle was more, it was a consistent cycle, which I liked. So you would sort of develop your show over the summer. We get a producer on board, around, early summer, develop it with them, because they're always really helpful. And then you pitch to the studio, end around whatever, August-ish, and then you're going and developing with them for a month or so, and then you go into the networks around like August, September. It kind of got later and later each year, but the one that always happened until this year was that you would develop the script with the network, and then you'd write the outline, and then your story area outline, and then the actual script, and you were getting notes back and forth, and then you turn in the final thing around Christmas, and then maybe you do another notes pass in January, but for the most part, you're just waiting. And then end of January, early February, you'd find out if you were a go. And then you get pick up and make the show. And then, obviously find out around now if it got picked up for a series. But now what happened this year, because they couldn't make any pilots, a lot of people who got pilots picked up got ordered second scripts. So now people sent in. So now people are going to read scripts, and hopefully people get shows picked up based off a second script. But that's the system this year. Hopefully, I would think things will get back normal, and then we'll go back to like making TV again. Hopefully,
that'd be nice.
That'd be good.
Yeah. So when you're pitching to a pod, do you have to have rep to make that connection and allow you to pitch, or can you look up pods yourself and find ones that work on shows that are similar to your style of what you want to pitch and reach out yourself? How does that work?
Generally speaking, you need reps are the ones who you'll pitch your idea to a rep, either your agent or your manager, and then they'll be the point person and say, okay, you should meet with this person because they're looking to do a workplace comedy right now, or you should meet with this person because they did this show last year and they had a lot of success with it and it sounds similar. They'll be the ones to sort of set those meetings. I don't think it's harder, I think, to just get to cold email them. And I mean, maybe if you have a personal connection with someone at a production company or a pod, you can do that. But I don't imagine that would be successful otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, the agencies, I know right now there's obviously time, there's no agents, but those agents always hooked us up. I mean, they put us together with a lot of places. Me personally, I've always had a good relationship with them, so they always helped. With setting up those kind of meetings. The other way to do it is because the other problem is like producers, they don't tend to meet with young writers necessarily to develop shows. They want to be working with like mid-level to senior level writers, who could run their own show. So I developed my show is with Doug Robinson, who's awesome producer who produced the Goldbergs. So I met him actually years ago when I was doing stand-up, but I got to him really well because of the Goldbergs. So we developed 2 pilots together. So that helps too. So a lot of times if you're on a show and you really get along with your EP and you think they're good, then that's always a very easy way to do it. But just to get a straight development producer, it's a little bit tricky in this environment, I feel like, if you're not already on a show.
Yeah, and that's why I ask, because of a lot of our viewers are indie content creators who have a plethora of ideas for shows and content, and some even have shot an entire pilot episode. And so for them, it's this tricky navigation of how do I get there to pitch all of these ideas I have when I don't have that rep yet to get to that next level. But it sounds like what you're saying is to keep networking and break into the room in that entry-level staff writer side and just keep building the relationships until you are able to pitch and be seen as someone that they can trust to run a room. Is that right?
Yeah. I think this sort of all goes with that. I mean, maybe it doesn't go without saying. The most important thing is to, getting a reps is probably, I think most people have either an agent or a manager before they're even in the world of getting a staff writing job. Like that's number one, or that is number one. So if you've created something really great and it already exists, then you should use that first to try to get a manager or an agent, or a friend at an agency who's not an agent but is on a great desk, someone who's going to get your stuff seen, who can then be your advocate. Because I think it's pretty hard to get these meetings, and it's hard to get your foot in the door if you don't already have someone who is saying, like, I have seen this person's work and it's good and I believe in them.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I feel like, the one good thing about the people who are probably watching this is that they have, physical content and not just scripts. So I feel like, sometimes for me, I was doing stand-up, but how I sold like one of my first shows was I created a web series for Crackle and it was called My Longest Relationship, and it was based on this like stand-up joke. And then I basically just made it into a web series, and then that web series we sold that to MTV by just showing them the webisode. So I think like sometimes short form presentation stuff works really well with producers, but again, like you definitely need, the key is to get all this stuff to like management and have someone sort of rep you and help you come through.
Yeah, that's great. That gives a feasible path for those at home, I'm hoping, to try and navigate the system. Yeah. And last year we did have a bunch of our creators who did come out of the festival with representation. So I hope that they're out there pitching right now. So when you're in your room, right? Writer's room, note cards all over the wall. It's crazy. Where do we start with those note cards? Where do we begin with this process of breaking your show?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I only use note cards for the episode titles and who's writing it. So like we had a board that I took from what we did, the Goldbergs, which had like a giant board, which was like episode, writer, A story, B story, and then when it was shooting. Because that was always the most important thing when you're in production, is like, when does this actually have to be like table ready, and when are we shooting it? Because that helps us like in terms of like rewriting and everything. But we do everything on the board, so we have like an idea, and we split rooms. That's like a big thing that we do, is we would have like a room and a B room going, and sometimes like another small room in my office.
Okay.
And we have a story room going sort of all day, and then a rewrite room. So early in pre-production, you have 2 story rooms going. And you would just have like someone would have an idea. Before I start, I have everyone send me like ideas, things that could work for like my show, like a family show. So I went through all the ideas and sort of like picked your top 10 ideas, and you start to go through each one and just talk through them at first. You get like a few people talking at once, and you kind of start like Neil's talking about in the beginning, just funny stories that relate to this sort of thing. And, just you start talking and figuring out how the characters could work in it, and you just kind of figure out the story. And then you have like your A story, and then we would do then our B story, and then we figure out ways to weave it in together. And if we like organically have a dovetail, we would do that, but we would break it down. NBC has 4 acts, so that was like a little tricky. So we would break it on the board in 4 acts. But before we even get there, we need to figure out like what the story is in general and get the story approved. So we need the story approved by the network. Then we have to break the story. Then we have to outline it on the board. Then we have to get that approved. And then after the outline, I did this thing where I would then send the outline to all the writers, and people would just send jokes to just add jokes throughout the entire outline. So then the writer would have an outline filled with the extra jokes. And then I'd sit with the writer and go through the entire outline, and then they'd go off and write the script. And that was sort of our system. So we spent a lot of time outlining it, hoping the network wouldn't throw it out.
Yeah. Wow, that sounds like a very busy, chaotic day. So you're just bouncing around.
Yeah, just going from like room to room and eating Erewhon. It's pretty fun.
Eating Erewhon and hopefully still getting little water bottles.
Yes, exactly. Big water bottle. I had a giant water bottle.
Good
I had a big water bottle. Yeah, that was my thing. But I don't know what it's like on the hour for bold type meal.
Yeah, I think I've worked on half-hour shows and I've worked on hour shows, and I think if you take 10 different shows, people have 10 different ways that they go about breaking stories. Like our show, The Bold Type, which is an hour-long dramedy, we had little magnetic cards, and it was a 6-act structure. And so we would spend, once we had a rough idea for an episode, someone would be the designated writer on the cards, and we would try to break each story by act. And then we would have like, at a certain point, there'd be like, 5 beats an act or whatever. So times 6 acts. So there's 30, 35 cards on a board. And then once you have the rough beats, then you would spend a lot of time like really figuring out in detail like what happens in each scene, and like very granular level of detail, like just so that when the writer goes off and writes it, not a lot is left. Obviously the dialogue and jokes and things like that are up to the writer, but like everyone is on board with like things happening in a very specific way in a specific order. And as Dan said, usually the network and the studio are giving feedback either at an outline phase or at a story area phase, so that when they get the script, they know what to expect, which isn't to say that they won't have notes or can throw things out, or they can say, we love that this took place at a party in the story area, and then when you write a party scene in the script, they're like, the party sucks. And you're like, we told you we were going to do it at a party, and those things happen all the time.
Sure.
It's thrown out, and you have to rewrite and reconfigure. But the actual process is, it's people sitting at a table and you figuring out exactly what goes into each beat as a group, and then one person sort of is responsible for going off and turning that into a cohesive episode of television.
Yeah. Very exciting. And I'm being told that we have a lot of questions coming in, so I want to cut right over to that so we can answer as many as possible.
Let's do it.
Philip, you want to hit us with our first question? What do we have? If I wrote a series idea, how hard is it to pitch myself as staying on as director and producer?
I think that depends on your level of experience. I think if you are just someone who has an idea, I would say that there's basically a 0% chance that they would let you be the director on the show. But if you have a body of work and you've made a bunch of things, directing it's pretty hard to become the director of a TV show, and the networks they have a list of people that they like working with. So at least at the major places, it's not that easy to just say, I have an idea and I want to be the director and also the producer.
Yeah, if you write like a movie and direct a movie that gets made and wins like Sundance, and you sell that TV show version of it to Netflix, then you could have a chance of definitely being like the EP and director. But if you pitch a show and you say, I want to direct it, and if they pick it up and make it, you'll be lucky if you're co-EP. They'll never let you direct it.
Right.
Unless, especially if it's like a half-hour sitcom. I think it's, maybe down the, I know people who have like directing experience who didn't like direct for a while. It's really hard. And it's a lot of pressure, and they don't want to risk it, in the beginning. But again, like if it's made, then it's a different story, because if you make something for them to see, for the most part, if you create a show and you have no experience, you'll still, your titles should still be like, if you have a good agent, I feel like co-EP or producer at the.
Everyone is basically a producer. It's the writers are all producers, and not all producers are writers, but all the writers are producers. But as far as directing goes, that's like a different thing.
Yeah.
Do you think it would help this person at all if they said, listen, I don't have to direct the pilot episode, but maybe take a block later on in the series?
Well, I mean, yeah, but I wouldn't say that, because I think you want to do everything in phases, because like who knows if the pilot will get picked up. So I think like what you want to do is you want to just do whatever you possibly can to sell the show and do.
Super Mario cereal.
There's Super Mario cereal.
Get your Super Mario cereal and your big water bottle.
The glimpse of the glamorous life again.
But that's what I would say, right, Neel? I mean,
you don't want to. You are not going in and making demands at any point of the process, especially if you're young and just getting started out. I mean, like if David Fincher is pitching a show, he could say, "Yeah, I want to direct it," and then they would let him direct it. But I think 99 out of 100 people who are selling shows are not also attaching themselves as a director.
Yeah, or honestly, like if David Fincher, they'll say we'll pick the series up if you direct it.
Right.
So that's what we'd say.
Perfect. Do we have another one, Philip? Man behind the scenes. Should I include act breaks in my pilot script when submitting to a network? Page count recommendation?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. For a 30-minute show, or a half-hour show, anything between, by the time you shoot it, it gets down. I guess, first of all, there's two different types of 30-minute shows. There's what's called a single-camera show, which is something like Modern Family, and then there's multicam shows, which are ones that are shot on sets, like Dan's show, which are tend to be longer, or just the formatting of them is different. So for a single cam show, the rough page count is, between 30 and 34, and multicams the spacing on them is different. So they're a little longer. But it's always helpful to include act breaks in those things. You want to show people that you know how to write.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like the sample scripts for multicams are always like 48 to 51 pages, the pilots. But when you're in a production, you like pray that they're like 44 pages. But shorter is always better, especially when you're reading people.
Yeah.
But so you want to try to be, I would say, like whatever the minimum is for page length, whether it's like 28 pages for a half hour or 45 pages for multicam, like I would aim for that.
Okay. Perfect. Next question. Are there a lot of shows with actors that are also writers on it?
There are some. It's not super common. I mean, famously on The Office, Mindy was a writer and BJ Novak were writers, and they were also actors. And the show Dan and I worked on, Whitney, her Cummings was a writer on it, and she was also an actor. It's not common, but it does happen.
Yeah. It's super. I mean, we weren't in the office room, and it was a single cam, so it was different. But on a multicam in particular, like the schedule is so insane that it's hard to be like a full-time writer and a full-time actor on the show, because you're rehearsing, and we don't start writing until you finish rehearsing. That's why the few people who have done it so successfully, like Seinfeld and Raymond and Kevin James, it's amazing, but it doesn't happen like all the time, because that format is just like, Whitney will say she passed away. It's like, it's really insane.
Oh my gosh.
But I think it's more common now that the actors, the bigger actors, are producers on the show. So I feel like Anthony Anderson is a producer on Blackish. Adam Pally is a producer on my show, and and those actors with tons of experience who are super talented are always helpful, especially with like ideas and anything like that. But as far as like sitting in the writer's room, they just don't have time, especially when like you're doing press. And honestly, I don't think they want it.
Right.
It's a way better job to be an actor on a multicam than to be a writer on a multicam.
And it feels like, going back to that director question, kind of that same vein of not asking for too much when you're so new to selling your own show and getting it created, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. If you're casting a show, like just like a regular, just like The Friend, and that friend is like, hey, I want to be a writer, and they're not a writer, you'd be like, I'm not even gonna cast you as an actor now.
That's it. You're done. Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Next one. I have a show Bible and have produced a pilot episode. What's the best way to get it in front of the right people?
Oh, wow. I mean, so this person presumably shot a pilot, which is amazing. I think the best way now is to try to network. Meet. If you're not meeting actual agents and managers, hopefully you're meeting their assistants and people who work for these people. There's a whole infrastructure of people out there in Los Angeles whose job is to just look at things that have been made and try to figure out if it's good and what they can do with that person. So if you have already made something, that's great, and congratulations. And then now, other than, I think there's obviously like the festival route too, although I don't know how Corona is impacting that. So, submitting it to festivals and getting it seen that way. But other than that, yeah, I think just try to send it around, put it on YouTube, tweet about it, just try to do what you can to get eyeballs on it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, the show Bible isn't as important, honestly. It's more about, I feel like show Bible is something you hear a lot about, but like the truth is, like, even when you're like waiting to hear if your series gets picked up, it's not so much a Bible as much as like episode ideas and, deeper development of the characters. But I think like a show Bible is something, maybe I think when you pitch just like a script, if you have a script to Netflix or a streamer, I think that's when they're super valuable. But yeah, I think Neel's right. I think you just put this pilot on YouTube and you just like aggressively DM people until they respond, and just try to get, I think you got to figure out what is the tone and figure out who is a big person, whether they're a writer or an actor, because an actor, like we just talked about, they can't be a writer, but if you go to like some sort of, if you know someone who knows someone, and then all of a sudden you have Michael B. Jordan saying he likes this sitcom, I feel like you could pitch that. Like Sandra Bullock produced the George Lopez show that was on ABC for 9 years or whatever, and she made a shitload of money, and people don't realize that. But that was her seeing him at the Laugh Factory and being like, he should have a show. Why doesn't he have a show? So
right.
I don't know that either. Good for her.
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of people, like a lot of like actors, are like celebrity actors, which I know are just as hard to get to than to an agent. But you never know. Those people are on Instagram all the time. You never know.
Right. Yeah. We'll take the next one, Philip.
Neel will get you Michael B. Jordan's email. Just send it.
Perfect. Thank you. Do writers typically get hired based more on their personality or the quality of their writing?
I think it's definitely both. I think what Dan was saying before is really relevant and bears repeating, which is that everyone who's going to get a meeting is someone who the agent or someone has read their script and said, this person has a good script and I think they could be a value add. And then once you're in that meeting, it's important to present yourself as someone who is capable and hardworking and funny and going to not be annoying to deal with. So it's really 50-50.
And also, when you are like in production, like people who could write good drafts are like so valuable. So a lot of times, and with the hiring process with the upper level is so intense that sometimes you might not have time to read someone's script who was on Modern Family for 6 years, but like you don't really need to. That they're like established. So it's more about calling the EP of Modern Family and saying, hey, is this person a good draft writer? Is this person super funny? Is this person annoying? Like those 3 questions. Whereas with the lower level writers who have been on shows, like I definitely read more scripts for staff writers and story editors and executive story editors than I did like anyone mid-level or upper level, because at that point, you hope that they have a funny script, and also the truth is, which is, just part of how this whole thing works. A lot of times, you go to your friends first or people who you've been in a room with. Unfortunately, when you get to like me and Neel, like Neel wasn't available to be on my show. Like a lot of your friends aren't available, but you kind of like go to those people first, and then you go, okay, who do those people know who are available?
Right. Yeah. So when they come in for those interviews with you, is it more of just a chat, a break the ice to get to know each other and see what that vibe is, if they're someone you click with?
Yeah. Because what would you say, Neel? Because
I think those meetings, like the general, I don't mean general meeting. They're called generals, which are the meetings that everyone goes on in LA. There tend to be like 10 to 15 minutes of just kind of filler and bullshit before you start talking about whatever it is that you have to talk about. So yeah, presenting yourself well is very important.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, and I also would say that just adding to that we've all had these meetings with showrunners too. So like I've also like over prepared and come up with ideas, and you go to these rooms and it's like the showrunner's just like, what's your address? Let's find it on Google Maps. And you do that for 20 minutes. And they're like, they loved you. You're like, what? I didn't even say anything. So that happens a lot too,
Yeah, those meetings they really just depend on who the person who's doing them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just be yourself.
Yeah.
Our next question is, how did you get your agents? Have you heard of non-repped writers selling a show? Is it just about networking in LA, or is being in New York okay too?
There's definitely a world. I mean, there's for sure a world of agents in New York. I know Dan's brother actually is an agent at UTA in New York City.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily have to be in LA. And I do know people who have gotten staffed on shows without agents. Those people did have managers though. So you generally need one, if not, you don't need 2, but you definitely need at least 1 to sort of be the person to be pushing you. And I think, again, getting your agent is kind of, if you talk to 50 different people, you'll have 50 different stories. I'm sure Dan involved his stand-up career. Mine was I had been a journalist in New York for a while, and then I wrote a script that someone who had an agent read and liked, and they passed it along to an agent. So it really is, unfortunately, just about getting your script read by as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And also, this is important, and making sure that when your script is read, that it's the best possible version. You don't want to go to something. You don't want to go to an agent's assistant with something that feels half-baked and say, "What do you think of this?" Because then that person will read it and sort of make a snap judgment, and you'll be known as someone who had a half-baked script. You want to make sure that when you are sending that script to be read by people who actually can do something with it, that it's been vetted by your friends, and it's tight, and it's been made as funny as possible, and it really is the best possible version before you start sending it out.
Right.
Yeah, I totally would. I totally would agree with everything Neel said. I mean, the other thing though is it's just weird right now because there is no agents. So, I mean, there are actually. That's the funny thing is, like, if you're not in WGA, which a lot of these young writers are, you could just sign with an agency. So it's actually probably so I don't know how all that stuff works. Yeah.
Right, because then if you're not with the WGA, you get an agent, but then you get staffed on a show, so now you're in the WGA, then do you have to fire your agent?
I don't know how it's all working.
It's a different webinar. I'll work on that.
The whole business is sort of in a process of transition now, so we'll see how it shakes out.
But I don't think, but usually, like, I haven't. Yeah, but you are hearing, like, you don't really hear of the shows being sold with no help of no agents or nothing.
Right. Okay. Well, we have a few more questions, so let's go on to the next one.
I have to get them cookies.
Okay, get the cookies. All right. So the next one for you, Neel, is: are there differences between pitching an indie TV idea for a network versus a streamer?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it. The place you're pitching, networks, tend to have like a very specific thing they're looking for. They tend to be either, the comedies tend to be a little broader, or so you wouldn't necessarily pitch an idea that was for ABC Family to Netflix. I guess it's a little confusing, because I guess Netflix now is doing so many different things that they do. Basically, they do everything. But you wouldn't pitch an indie idea. If you wanted to have something that felt really indie and specific, you would not pitch that to a network. You would go to a Netflix or an Amazon or a Hulu or Apple TV, or something that felt a little bit more auteurish or specific. Netflix is just a weird one because they do literally everything now.
Yeah.
But there's no difference in the pitching process. That is the same. You meet with the pod, you figure out the pitch, and then you just go to them and actually pitch the show.
All right. Great. We'll move on to the next one. How do I know if a show idea has already been pitched to a network or studio before? Are there still original ideas?
It's a good question. You don't know. I mean, hopefully if your idea is like, it's 7 friends sitting around in a coffee shop, someone will tell you, like, that show has been pitched 1,000 times.
Right.
So I would definitely try to, do a little bit of due diligence about your show idea before you actually get in the weeds of doing it. But it's funny, every year, I'm sure, Dan would agree, there are specific ideas or iterations of the same idea that tend to go and have legs, like a blended family, or a family like cop shows or procedurals. These are things that have, I'm sure there's been 1,000 different hospital shows pitched, or 1,000 different shows pitched at a FBI agency. So it's about finding a specific that makes them feel new. But I wouldn't totally be discouraged if someone said your idea has been done before, just as long as you feel like you're doing it well.
Yeah,
Right.
I feel like every idea has been pitched, honestly, like, with the exception of like Stranger Things, every once in a while there's some like crazy, amazing idea that leftovers or something completely insane.
Yeah.
But every version of like a family show or a work, there's always something that is similar. So I think it becomes I feel like what I sort of have learned is just like the more specific you are, the better. Like a premise could be something that's been done a lot, but if you're specific about the characters or there could be like my family and Neel's family are very different, but we could do the same idea of like looking back at our childhood, or like what it's like to be married in LA, but like it will be a completely different point of view, So I think what comes down to everything in like writing and comedy and just in general is like the point of view and the specificity of that thing,
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, I feel like this question is almost a limiting belief. Like I got to be careful of not taking someone else's ideas versus how am I going to tell this story differently?
Right.
Right.
Nope.
And I know we're running short on time, but we have one more question. So let's get this last question in there real quick before we need more Mario charms. What are the top 3 things a show trailer or proof of concept should include? What exactly is the showrunner's role?
We'll say that one more time.
Okay. So what are the 3 things that a show trailer or a proof of concept that one would use in a pitch? What should it include?
I don't know that you need a trailer to do a pitch. I think a pitch is more, or even a proof of concept. Those are not traditionally tools used for pitching shows. For a pitch, you generally have a really detailed, rundown of who the characters are and like what the world of the show is, and a little bit of a preamble as to why this show needs to be made now and like what it is that specifically you're hoping to do. But you don't need to have made anything to do a pitch. Dan, do you would?
Yeah, I would say like the most important things are like, your log line, the characters, why this show is personal to you, and like 1 or 2 episode ideas. And I don't think you could put all of that in a trailer. I know when Adam Goldberg sold the Goldbergs, he had all this family footage that is on the episode on the show today. So that was like an amazing proof of concept, which is basically like I documented my entire childhood with my video camera. And it was called, I think the original show is called like How Am I Not Fucked Up, or like so it was basically like Fucked Up Wonder Years essentially was the pitch, and it was all this footage of his childhood, and that was like incredible because he introduced every character, and that was awesome because then you sort of know that in every episode you're going to see a little piece of footage and hear the characters. So I think like unless you could do something so specific in a trailer where you're like hitting all these characters, like that's what people are buying.
Right.
So I think you're better off, like Neel's saying, just having 8 pages and just screaming at executives for 30 minutes.
Yes. Oh, gosh. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today. I know we're running out of time. Everybody at home, stay tuned for what we have coming up next week. And remember, you got to stay hydrated. Everyone get their big old water bottles out there. Thanks, guys.
See you later. Thank you.